Shalom Bethel family. It is Thursday, once again time to review our Torah portion, our Torah discussion from last Saturday at Congregation Bethel here in Norfolk, Virginia. Last week was a big Shabbat from the point of view of what the service looked like. We had 3 Sifrei Torah out from the Ark. Somewhat unusual occurrence, only a couple times that happens outside of Simchat Torah. So there was a lot of Torah to do. The reason why was it was Parshat Vayikra, our regular Shabbat Torah reading. It was Rosh Chodesh, and then it was also a special Shabbat HaHodesh, which is the Shabbat immediately preceding or on Rosh Chodesh before Passover, Nisan, for the month of Nisan. So all those things came together. And in Shul, we talked about the Parsha, but also about Shabbat HaHodesh and Passover coming, and how this all ties up. So to start out with, you need to understand, you need to know that Vayikra, the actual word, right? And he called Moses, Vayikra, is spelled in the Torah itself with a diminutive alef, right? The alef is a little bit smaller than the entire rest of the Torah text. There's a lot of questions. What does this mean that we have this small alef? And I would say that a number of the explanations that are related to that will help us understand not only this idea of Vayikra, of being called by God, but also help us understand there's a connection to Shabbat HaHodesh and to Passover and to what we should be doing over these next 2 weeks. The first explanation for the little aleph that I think we can get insight from is the explanation of the Ballot Orem. The Ballot Orem notes that Moshe Rabbeinu would have wanted the word Vayikra written without the letter alef at the end. Thus it would read Vayaker. He happened upon. Why? Because this is how the Torah describes God's meeting with Balaam. Right? Balaam, the non-Jewish, non-Israelite sorcerer or prophet who God talks to in the Book of Numbers, the Book of Bamidbar. Why does Moses want that? Because he's suggesting he wanted it to be that God, did not want to speak to Moses specifically, right? But more like Bilam, the only reason God spoke to Bilam, Vayaker, he happened upon him, it was casual. And so too, Moshe, in his profound humility, said, it should be like casual with me. It shouldn't be that God wanted specifically to speak to me. But God did not want the Torah to express God did want, the Torah to express his great esteem for Moshe Rabbeinu, and so he insisted that it say Vayikra over Moshe's objections. Because God wanted everyone to know that Moshe was important, is important, that it is important that it was specifically Moses who God came to. Of course, Moses had the pen, right? So he writes the small letter aleph, right? And it's a compromise. So it says Vayikra, God has God's way, but Moshe was also expressing his own humility, that he's only a human being, even if a special human being, and that it was ultimately, his honor and his privilege to be able to speak with God, not something he necessarily deserved. What does this have to do with Passover? Well, the whole point of the Ballot Orem's comment is about humility. Moshe was able to communicate with God, to hear God's call, because he was able to get out of his own way, right? In order to hear God in the world around us, we need to be humble. We need to stop thinking so much about ourselves, to step out of ourselves so that we can sense that which is around us and which is greater than us. Only truly a humble person can do that. Well, Passover is a little bit about humility too, right? Over these 2 weeks, we're to be cleaning out the chametz, the leavened yeast products. Why? What is the problem with chametz? Well, one explanation is that it's all puffed up, right, with air. And just like when we're all puffed up and prideful, we can't really be spiritual. And so this is a reminder that as we clean out the chametz, we also need to be cleaning out our spirit to find our humble place again so that we can be pure like the matzah, right? Flat, nothing puffing it up. And only when we do that will we be able to Vayikra on Passover, will we be able to hear God's voice calling to us on Passover. So number one, we need to learn to get out of our own way. The second explanation that I'd like to share is one that's drawn from the Book of Kings, when it talks about how Elijah the prophet heard God's call. Right? He was forced to run off from Israel by the king Ahab and his queen Jezebel after all of Elijah's disciples were going to be killed, and he runs off to where else? To the Sinai, to the mountain of revelation itself. And there he goes into a cave. And God comes to him and says, "Go forth and stand upon the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a kol demama daka, a still small voice. And it was so when Elijah heard it, the still small voice, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out, and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "What are you doing here?" asks the still small voice. This is another key for understanding how to hear God around us, right? We want big deals, we want miracles, we want to see God in mountains and in sunsets and in oceans. But in fact, the real way to hear God calling to us all the time is to listen for that call to mamadaka, to listen for that still small voice all around us. God is in the details. Right? We find God, we'll sense God in the details. And so only when we're involved in the details, and Passover is so much about the details, the cleaning, the crumbs, the cracks, you got to get everything out of every place. And the Seder with its order and all its particular parts. What's with all the details? It is in those fine points, in those details, that in fact we can sense God calling to us and God being close to us. We in this culture want to live in great big brushstrokes. But in fact, the best works of art are done finely, just like the best lives. And when we pay attention to those little details in our lives, we will ask God, reminding us, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here, Jeffrey? What are you doing here?" Comes on the still small voice. And so the Vayikra and this preparation for Passover remind us to pay attention to the details and to listen for that still small voice. But the third and most important explanation for that alef that I want to share today is another way to hear that voice calling to us. And it comes from Rabbi Naftali Tzvi of Ropshitz. I heard it for the first time actually from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. But so what did the Ropshitzer Rebbe say? He said, in an explanation of what the people heard on Sinai, right? So I'm co-opting this comment. The Ropshitzer is talking about revelation at Sinai. And there's an idea that all that the whole Jewish community was able to hear of the 10 commandments, the 10 utterances on Sinai, was the alef of Anochi. Right? Alef has no sound of its own. It is the potential for sound. And it was that potential for connection with God that the people witnessed, that it was the alef that they heard. An alef just like the one we have here in Vayikra. And what does Rabbi Naftali Tzvi say about it? It says, well, God is indeed formless at Sinai. The people did see a representation of the divine, or maybe not see, but sensed the letter Aleph. Where did the Israelites see the Aleph? Was it projected in the sky? Like the bat signal? Okay, I added the bat signal part. He didn't know from the bat signal, but right? That's the image, this Aleph projected in the sky, this knowledge of God's presence. Did it take the form of a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud of smoke like the people would follow in the desert? No. The Aleph appeared on the faces of the people. Now you have to imagine what an aleph looks like. But it's a line diagonally, a vav, with a yud over here and a yud over here, right? That makes almost like an X, but a lot more stylized. But if you turn that image so that the vav is upright, so that the line is upright, in fact, you'll see a deconstructed human face. Right here, the nose, the line of the nose is the vav, each eye represented by one of the yuds. The Ravshitzer goes on, if each eye represents a letter yud, and the nose represents a vav, when you put the numerical values of those letters together, each yud is worth 10, the vav is worth 6, you get 26. The same number in God's most sacred name, Yud He Vav He. Right? So in the aleph, in the yud yud vav anyway, in a person's face, we can sense the divine. And that's that last way, maybe the most important way, to hear God calling to us to Vayikra, right? Hear God calling me. Where do I hear? Where do I sense God? When I look at another human being's face and I see that aleph. In fact, I hear God when I do for that other person, right? When I'm giving, when I'm helpful. And that we see that theme in Passover all around as well. Right? Who should be at your Seder? All who are hungry. Let them come and eat. Who do we make sure has, not anymore, but when we had a Passover sacrifice, a Paschal lamb, anyone who couldn't afford their own, them we had to feed. And that should be a message we embrace too as Passover approaches in this week and a half, as we clean out our chametz and we think about humility, about getting out of our own way to sense God, to get that puffed upness out of our spirit and be flat and pure like the matzah. As we listen for that call to Mamad Dakah, as we do all the details for the holiday, the third and most important thing is we should be looking for God's divine presence in each other. Look to human beings and understand that that is an extension of God, and so are you, and that we will really hear God calling in our interactions with each other when we interact in a sacred and a holy way, when we do for others. And we should prepare to do that for Passover and beyond. And if we can embrace all of those three things, humility and looking in the details and understanding that our greatest connection to the divine, the greatest representation, that the image of the divine is right there before us in each and every human being, when we can do all that, I assure you, you and I and all of us will have that sense of the sacred, the sense of the divine in our lives. May we all be able to achieve that connection on this Passover holiday and in all the years to come. Look forward to seeing you in shul on Saturday, on Shabbat, and I wish you a very peaceful and wonderful Shabbat ahead.